Just had a conversation with Winn Collier. I've known about him for many years, but in the last several months and then in the last weeks, I've started to read some of his works. Most recent book is a biography of Eugene Peterson, who is probably most well known for the Message translation of the Bible. The book is called A Burning in My Bones, and it is incredible. Winn is an incredible storyteller, brilliant writer. I mean, you could just read sentences by themselves, almost as poetry, just incredibly gifted. So the book is phenomenal and gives a really cool insight into a very good and close friend of God, Eugene Peterson. And Eugene, I never met him, but I've met enough people now who knew him, who speak so highly of him, his authenticity. He was very much a man that loved God and loved family and loved the church and loved pastors and raised up pastors to love and serve people well. And we talk about that. The second half of the conversation, we talk about that book and the role of pastors in the church. We get into a conversation about the church today. It was late in the conversation. I think we could have spent the whole conversation talking about it. On the front end of this, we talked about the cross. We talked about cruciform love. We talked about our high value for humanity. I used this phrase a couple times. We belong to one another. It's a phrase I had read in one of Winn's articles, and we spent a lot of time on that through line, that high value for humanity. We belong to one another. What does that mean? What does that look like at a cross? What does that look like if you're looking at the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus? What does that look like in the context of creation? Winn takes us back to the Garden of Eden and describes the goodness of God, his mercy and his kindness and his goal of union. I really love this conversation. Winn is thoughtful, well-read, sincere, and loves God, and he loves humanity. And it was just a privilege to have a conversation with him. You can learn more about Winn at winncollier.com, WINNCOLLIER. And I think you'll want to. I think you'll want to read his words. They're filled with hope and life. And as it reads in his bio, the thread through all his work is delight in the God who exists as the blazing center of everything that is good, beautiful, and true. So you're going to feel that on this podcast. You're going to feel Winn's conviction regarding a good, beautiful, and true God. As always, good to be on the journey with you guys. If you want to keep up with what I'm doing, articles, this podcast, or books, I got one coming very soon now. You can go to afamilystory.org, sign up for our mailing list. We mail out about 2 emails a month, keep you up to date. And when it comes to this podcast, like it, share it, write a review on iTunes. These are helpful ways in which to grow the audience. All right, guys. I think you're really going to be blessed by this, my conversation with Winn Collier. Hey, it's great to meet you.
Yeah.
Honored to connect with you finally.
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation. It was kind.
Yeah, absolutely. We have, I don't know if mutual friends is the right thing, but I've known John Blaze for many years. He helped me with 2 books, my first and my second.
Yeah.
And so I really love that guy. Love his writing.
Yeah, he's one of my dearest friends.
I knew you guys were close. That was my impression anyway. And
Yeah.
so I've known of you peripherally, but in the last little bit, gotten to know you a little better. It's good to have you on, Winn. It's awesome to finally connect face to face. So I've been looking forward to getting to know you a little bit, to have a conversation with you about the love of God, the goodness of God, about what you're running at. Could you share a little bit with the folks who are listening about yourself, what you do, and what you're dreaming into right now?
Sure. So I'm a husband to Miska and dad to Wyatt and Seth. We're now empty nesters, 2 boys in college. We do have a dog, Gus. So Gus is a big old goofball.
What kind of dog?
He's half Bernese Mountain Dog and half Poodle.
Woo, he's big.
He's big. Miska was hoping he'd be about 90 pounds. He's only about 70.
Okay.
So she was a little disappointed, but he is so stubborn that I don't think we could handle 20 more pounds. So,
That's
but
awesome.
he's
Is he a lover? Does he? My parents have a Bernice, and he lays on you everywhere you go. He lays on you.
he does. He's as he gets older. He's now like 2.5 years old. He does more of that. But Miska had a friend who had a dog like Gus and was really wanting. Uh, this dog was very aloof, like very loyal to his family, but very aloof to sort of other people, at least at first. And Miska kind of like that. But Gus is the opposite. I
Yeah.
mean, Gus will run after any stranger and lick them to death
Right.
and
Right.
take off after the
Yeah.
next squirrel, and off he goes. So, not quite the lumbering giant that we had hoped for, but
Right.
we
Right.
love him. So yeah. So we live in Holland, Michigan. We've lived here 2 years. I am. We moved here from Charlottesville, Virginia,
Okay.
where I was the uh, pastor of All Souls. I've been a pastor for 26 years, but 2 years ago moved to Holland, Michigan to work at Western Theological Seminary, uh, and to teach here and to help to found the Eugene Peterson Center for Christian Imagination. So I'm a pastor and a writer
Yeah.
who happens to serve and work at a seminary.
And a phenomenal writer. We're just meeting, so we have some things in common you may not know. I'm a writer as well, and I've actually in the last several years, because of the pandemic, found myself not writing biographies but helping people write their memoirs, and absolutely mesmerized by not just what you're running at, but the way in which you communicate. It's just I was reading through some of your articles, and I was like, oh my goodness, this guy has got such a grace and a skill set for words. I love your approach. It's such a generous approach to humanity. And there's a phrase, and I think we'll start here, and I'd love you to speak to it. There was a particular story you told where the title is "We Belong to One Another."
Yeah,
And I thought, my goodness, everything I read from this man, I would say that's his through line. That seems to be his approach to all things, is this idea that we belong to one another. I would love if we could start there, and then dive into a little bit of Eugene Peterson, because I know that's a big part of what you've been doing, and the book
yeah,
that has most recently come out.
yeah. I mean, are there very many things that we could say that are more true to the divine and human story than we belong to one another,
Yeah,
and how that is that the Trinity is at the very center of that. That we belong to God, and
yeah,
God belongs to us. And
yeah,
in fact, just today I was reading a story about a Danish photographer who has spent the last 5 to 6 years photographing starlings as they migrate across Europe.
yeah,
And I've had this experience a couple times. I wonder if you have, where you see um, the starlings moving in their fluid motions.
yeah.
They call them murmurations,
Right,
and it's if you see it, it's spellbinding. It's like this wave in unison of massive darkness against the sky,
right.
and it's like a flowing kaleidoscope. And
As if they're of one mind, all moving together. Yeah, yeah,
exactly, yeah. And they're moving in such unison and such tight formation that they say that if one of these starlings misses a beat, that there will be mass cataclysm, because it's literally hundreds of thousands, and
right.
they're taking instantaneous reaction to their closest neighbor,
Wow,
moving as one. And it's
wow.
beautiful, and there's lots of reasons I think why this happens. But one of the reasons, which I didn't know, is it's an act of protection of one another.
Wow.
That when a predatory hawk descends on these tiny little creatures, these little starlings, that this hawk would just gobble them up one by one, pick them off
Wow.
if
Okay.
they were by
Right.
themselves. But they form this tight formation, and they defend and beat back this hawk because they're moving as one.
Wow.
And I just thought, um, it seems like that we're intended to live that way. That that um, if there's something that aches in our heart to be within a community, that's natural instinct is to together tight, together to watch out for one another, to move as one, to have one heart.
Yeah.
And I think that's why um, when we see communities and societies and friendships and neighborhoods and cities and countries, when we see the destruction that we do against one another, why it's so devastating.
Right. Right.
Because this is not what we were created for.
Yeah.
But we were created to be one with God. At the very beginning of our story is immense goodness and God's great delight in calling us into the world, dreaming us up, crafting us out of the dirt with the artistry of a potter, and then setting us in the bountiful goodness of creation, where there was also a lot of barrenness, and says, together with me in the world, go make beauty.
Wow. Wow.
And so that's why it's both such tragedy at what we've done, and yet still such immense hope and possibility over what God's hope and heart is for us to be. And it is about belonging together.
Bro, that's the good news that Jesus revealed. I'm fascinated by the Lord's Prayer, but not the one he taught us. That's a beautiful one, but the one he prayed in John 17 when he said, "I pray that you would know this oneness, that you would be one, that you would know the oneness that I know with my Father." By the way, I call him Dad. It's all a relational dynamic. I call you friend and brother. I pray that you would know that oneness, that union, and that he went even further to say that so that the whole world might know, that the whole world might experience that. I'm tracking with you. You reminded me of a story, and it kind of ties in a little bit. I think my grandmother lived to be 100. She was a saint. In fact, I was reading Eugene Peterson, your book. I've only gotten the first few chapters, but I was reading about Evelyn, and she actually his mom, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she reminded me of my grandmother, and that you mentioned at one point that she was always talking to God or talking out loud, and yeah, I love you, Jesus, or thank you, Jesus. And that was my grandmother, always talking, always praying. And if you got close, you'd realize, you thought in those last years she was in pain, but it was more she was just in love and talking to Jesus. And when she died at 100, I don't know how I got the opportunity, but I was there packing, going through some of her things, and I found her Bible. And for a few weeks, I didn't tell the rest of my family. I took it home and I opened up, and it's marked up on every page and every color, and in the margins there's notes, and then there was these little slips of paper that would fall out, and I took pictures of them, and one of them was a poem that just moves me every time. It's by Edwin Markham, but I didn't know it at the time. And it's just a simple poem. It says, "He drew a circle that shut me out, heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle and took him in."
Hmm.
It's called Outwitted. And every time I'd hear it, I thought, I do not know what circles my grandmother was drawing with our Heavenly Father. But everything in it is about how love has the wit to win. It has the wit to draw a bigger circle and a bigger circle and a bigger circle. And the first time I ever heard that phrase, "we belong to each other," was by a guy by the name of Father Greg Boyle, who's, if you're familiar with him,
Yeah.
out of Los Angeles, and works with young fellas that are coming out of gang life and giving them a future and a hope. But that was a phrase he said: "We belong to one another." And I remember reading that and having this epiphany that at the cross there is no us and them, there is no for or against, there is no hierarchy, no dualistic good and evil. We're all us. We belong to one another. We're all us. And I would love for you to speak to some of that. I imagine you could go into the deep end on some of those thoughts.
Well, I think I think there's a story that gets told, and there's like threads of, in every lie there's a thread of truth. and and the story that gets told is that our natural habitat is to be at odds with God.
Right.
um, and God's natural habitat is to be at odds with us, and angry
Yeah.
and perturbed, and just waiting to finally wipe this thing clean and be done with it.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
um, if something like that story weren't so um, common to hear, it'd be perplexing to think, have we ever read our Bibles? Because the natural habitat of humanity is to be enveloped in the love of God,
Right.
to be hearing the voice of God. And
I love that, man. The natural habitat of humanity.
yeah,
Yeah.
um, Augustine would say that um, there isn't. It's even wrong to think of something as purely evil, if by that we mean um, some uh, some power that exists in the world that is somehow in any way on the same plane as God. That's just the dichotomy of God. Um, Evil is merely the distortion of goodness.
Yeah.
Satan and the kingdom of darkness can't create anything. All they can do is degrade what is beautiful and good.
Right. Yeah.
And so when that gets degraded, it just means we're deforming from our truest beauty. So um, to think that, at the cross, Jesus was um, putting back together what God has always been bringing together, which is bringing wholeness again, to be with. and
That's it. That's it.
and so it changes our understanding of God. It changes our understanding of ourselves, and it actually makes running away from God all the more ridiculous, because we're running away from our true selves. We're running away from the beat of our own heart.
Yeah.
We're running away from our own breath.
Yeah.
Um, and yet, we do destructive things, and but it's the voice of love that calls us back.
That's good. It's good. You, I think early on in the newest book, you reference, forgive me, I don't remember the quote by who it was. We become what we behold. Is that it? Yeah, William Blake. We become what we behold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think a whole lot of what you're talking about. I'm writing something right now, um, finishing up a book titled "Leaving and Finding Jesus," and the idea being, through the lens of the Emmaus Road, that the stranger will walk with us to reveal Christ to us in ways that he has to hide himself to reveal himself to us. Otherwise, our preconceived ideas of what he's already like would get in the way of a stewarding or a revelation of that burning. And then the point being that the cross, that there's a particular lens that I grew up with, where the cross was this retributive thing that took place. This father that looked away, this father that is separate, this father that would abandon, and that actually is quite the opposite. That God was in Christ reconciling, and that reconciliation is actually the lens through which you then can perceive who God is. And if you're perceiving through a lens, if you become what you behold, then you're living as an expression of reconciliation. You write about it. I actually pulled the notes down from your an article you wrote called "Resurrection and Creation,"
Sure.
where you, is it all right if I read some of it to you?
No.
Or
No.
unless you've got things you already are like, don't go anywhere else. I want to. John's gospel takes great literary pains. Everybody listen to a wordsmith, by the way. This is just beautiful. To set Jesus' story as the inbreaking, well, we could spend time there, of a new creation, a healing of the entire cosmos, bloodied and scarred by human rebellion and hubris. And John wants to make certain we know that it was in a garden where Jesus' dead corpse was buried, and that in this garden, those courageous, bewildered women discovered that this corpse was no longer a corpse. It all happened in a garden. This is the thing I want you to speak to. Maybe we thought Eden was completely lost, but Eden would be remade again.
Yeah, it seems like every story somehow finds its way back to Genesis, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The garden imagery of the Bible, it's remarkable to think about how um, it wasn't just that we were placed in the garden and that was to be our home, but Genesis is very clear about that the garden is in the east of Eden, and the Eden is sort of in the east of the known world at that time. And when Adam and Eve were um, removed from the garden, and I take that to mean uh, not so much as a punishment, but actually as a strange mercy, because the tree of knowledge of good and evil, I don't think was that Adam and Eve were never to have that. I think that they were supposed to grow in maturity and to become like God, like their Father, so that the day would come when they could eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and be wise and discerning like God. But like we humans do, they grabbed it too soon.
Okay.
They believed the lie that God's heart wasn't really for them and they needed to watch out for themselves.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. That lie of separation, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
So it would be pure terror to all of a sudden have the knowledge of good and evil, and um, in a way when you cannot manage it, and also to be eating the tree of life. That would be an endless cycle of destruction.
Right.
So God, in a pained mercy, sends Adam and Eve out of the garden. But I take that to mean that they were supposed to do what they were originally supposed to do, which was to be fruitful and fill and multiply and basically spread Eden over the entire creation.
Right.
And now, scarred and wounded, they are still have that same mandate to take God's love and beauty and goodness and spread it over all of creation. But now it is hard labor, and it is work, and we're um, cornered by it, and we fail, and so Eden wasn't abandoned. Um, Jesus came as the one who is now hung on another tree, like the tree of life.
Right.
The tree that killed in Genesis is the tree that heals in the Gospels, and it is also the tree which is by the river of life in Revelation.
Right.
So this entire story is a sweeping story of God's relentless um, pursuit of love that will not be turned away by even the deepest and darkest rebellion and evil.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about what is the human place in this, I mean, we are the image bearers
Yeah.
of the one who is creating and loving and making beautiful and good. And so, I mean, this is why I have immense hope
Right.
in a time where sometimes it's really hard
Yeah.
to hold on to.
Yeah.
But the hope isn't in Winn. The hope isn't even in um, the Christian movement.
Right.
The hope is in the Jesus who makes Eden happen,
Yeah.
and who rises from the dead to destroy everything that kills.
That's so good. I remember several years ago, uh, talking about the tree of life, and I'm not going to be able to give you the address, but I know it's hope deferred. It's Proverbs. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but longing fulfilled or desires fulfilled is the tree of life, and it's somewhere in Proverbs. But I remember I was out for a walk, and I had been having a conversation with God. When God asks you something, for me anyway, He's not asking you, is it possible? He's telling you, hey, I'd like you to contemplate life now through the possibility. I'd always said this: hope deferred was like a description, I guess, of. I would look at it and go, that's a good way by which to describe what I'm feeling today. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. Yep, that's a good way to describe what I'm experiencing. Boy, it'd be nice to have some of that tree of life.
Mm.
but I thought the tree of life was connected to longing fulfilled. And so I'm out for a walk, and he says, you know that it's possible to live uh, 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 with longing fulfilled
Hmm.
in the context of the tree of life. And I think what he was saying is it's possible to live in the knowledge of good and evil from the tree of life, from longing fulfilled, regardless of what you're experiencing in the moment, that there is a way to live in the context of longing fulfilled. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a poetry.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm not, you're not talking to an academic at all, man. You're talking to a relational theologian at best.
That's the best kind.
Well, I do think if that isn't a part of what you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, for sure.
But let me ask you this: how did you get here, man? This is the question. How do you get into a place where you're hopeful, uh, especially right now? I mean, there's, like you said, we're maybe in maybe the most dualistic, polar opposite, conflict-driven culture, maybe in my lifetime. How are you here? What's the journey that got you so convinced
Yeah.
that you can, or so
Yeah.
confident in hope? Or can I say you're confident in hope?
Yeah. I think you can say I'm confident in hope.
Yeah.
I don't think you could say I'm confident in humans, um, or that my hope is always confident, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
But there is a kind of confidence that comes uh, by hope in God. It doesn't mean it never wavers, and it doesn't mean I don't have immense spaces of doubt and confusion. Um, I think it was Alistair McIntyre who said, before you decide what to do, you first have to decide what story it is you're living in.
Right. That.
So I think a lot of the dilemmas that we're in is because we are confused about the stories we're living in, or we're taking on certain stories that are really damaging.
Yeah.
So if the story I'm living in is how humans are supposed to constantly be evolving and moving to higher and higher states of consciousness so that we, by our own machinations, finally make the world good, then
That's a
I am
good.
screwed.
Yeah, we're pretty discouraged right now.
We are all, yeah, because that, that story, which has been an important part of Western philosophy and religion,
Sure.
of
Sure.
endless improvement, you know, it's just not true.
Yeah.
I mean, it fits and starts, and in some ways we're really improved, and in other ways we're not.
Yeah.
In some ways we're making advances, in other ways we're destroying things more.
Yeah.
So the fact is that I have been drawn into, undone by the story of Jesus the Christ, and um, Jesus is not for me an ethical option. Jesus is not a sort of moral project. Jesus is the center of all that is reality.
Yeah.
And I have fully set my sail with the story that the one who was God uh, has forever joined humanity with God in the person of Jesus. And this God's love um, is so immense and to our minds unthinkable that this God would surrender um, his own self to the despair of death in order to rescue us.
Yeah.
Um, and that rescue is far more cosmic than we've ever imagined.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Wow.
if that's the story I'm living in, then not only do I have hope because Jesus raises dead things to life,
Yeah.
um, but also, for the most part, the story that I encounter actually makes sense.
Yep. That's right. Yeah.
I understand better uh, why we are so despairing and why we are doing such damage to one another and to creation. And all of the things that seem to be in this moment and much of the American church sort of ripping us apart is so, like, if you're living in the story of Jesus, the resurrection, like, there's none of, I mean, we 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 see this coming, and we have already been told by the one who created all that is hopeful, uh, where to go with this, and so that's why I have hope,
Yeah.
because of the story
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
embraced.
My friend who's often co-hosts with me, Derek, and I'm going to say it because he almost says it every podcast. He became one of us to rescue all of us, is one of Derek's phrases. And him and I were talking yesterday,
Hmm.
and we were talking about one of the things he rescued us from that we had never really jumped into before. But it fits in that we become what we behold idea, that he rescued us from our broken and flawed thoughts about him,
Hmm.
that he rescued us from our punishing and cruel thoughts about him, and if there's a hope for me, it's, if all the law and the prophets can come down to love, Jesus described it. The greatest love is that you would lay your life down for a friend, and then revealed that great love, that cruciform love at a cross that ultimately concluded in resurrection life or eternal life. That's where the hope is. The hope is for me the idea of separation that you talked about, and went out of your way to say God wasn't playing a game of separation in the garden. That was actually mercy and grace and kindness, because that is the nature of God. He speaks in the language of our understanding to the limitations of our ability to perceive and understand it. Be me talking to my 5-year-old is different than me talking to my 15-year-old, and I love that, because I think for me, maybe the greatest thing he rescued us from is the idea that he participates or plays the game of separation, and that actually wasn't what was taking place at the cross, that the Father didn't look away, and that God was in Christ. And so, boy, if you can't find hope there, because it says so much about who he is, therefore it says so much about who we are. It says so much about his high value for humanity, his great affection for us. I love that, man. I really do. I love that you shared that. That is an area we're called Rethinking God with Tacos. That is something that I think right now the church is rethinking. We're rediscovering. And why it's one of the things that moves me, that drives me, that I'm passionate about, is I'm convinced you can't have connection or intimacy or experience union with someone you can't trust. And if he isn't always good, if he is turning away, if he is playing the game of separation, then that's an area where you can no longer trust him, and therefore you're cut off from that place. And so I've had a lot of rethinking in my life, a lot of places where I've discovered his goodness, where I've found myself partnered with the older brother, outside of reconciliation against the very heart of my father. And I'd be curious if after this, I want to ask you about Eugene Peterson, because I know we're going to spend some time on that. But I'd be curious if you have any specific thing right now that you're like, oh, I'm rethinking this, I'm rediscovering this, or if there's some place you could point to that said this was something that when I shifted my thoughts about who he was, um, it changed my approach to how I lived my life, how I loved my wife, or how I played with
Yeah,
my dog, or so on and so forth.
the first thing that comes to mind is kind of along the themes we've already been talking about, which is, um, if Jesus is the true human, and if in the person of Jesus, God was doing more than merely showing us what humanity could be, but actually, um, Jesus taking into his own body all of humanity, which is precisely what Paul tells us, that that in
Yeah,
that in Jesus
yeah,
we are buried, and in Jesus we come to life, and that's not
it's
one person or two. I mean, it's the whole.
it's all creation. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
and if in God, in Christ, God was reconciling humanity to God,
yeah,
that and in the ascension, Jesus as a human returns to the Trinity. So
yeah.
Jesus even now is the true human in the God's own Trinitarian self.
Wow.
As Rowan Williams likes to say, now when Jesus speaks in the Trinity, he is using human words.
Wow. Oh my
Um,
goodness, that's awesome.
and so, if that's true, then that means humanity, God has forever joined humanity to God's self.
Yeah.
And so, if that's true, then the disposition of God toward humanity is fundamentally different than sometimes we think about.
Right.
And it's why running from God is so disastrous.
Yeah. Yeah.
'Cause it's running from our own self.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Wow, that's profound, man.
and so it just it and it, yeah, I'm having to constantly, as you're saying, I'm having to constantly rethink that because um, I think the old tracks um, of God being at odds with me.
Right.
Um, Now I want to be really careful here because I think there's an equal disastrous trap, which is we make God just be like us,
Right.
so that God sort of approves of everything we approve of, and God disapproves of everybody we disapprove of, and
Right.
God becomes really small. And I mean, God is cosmically large.
Do you see
And
the new photos from the new telescope or space?
oh,
Oh my
yeah,
goodness! Talk about
yeah,
just expanding how big God is, man. Wow.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we've lost a sense of the holy, and we ought to tremble,
Yeah.
not in fear, but in
Yeah.
absolute
Yeah.
awe and wonder. And we ought to
Yeah.
bow our knee and
Yeah.
proclaim Jesus as Lord, because
It-
that's our hope.
and the only
Yeah,
and the overflow of it's a response. I don't know how you could respond any other way if you actually where the eye is clear, the body's full of light, and
yeah,
man, if the body's full of light, the response is awe
yeah. That's
and
right.
wonder and hope, and that's amazing. Let's talk about what you're doing now and the incredible honor. As I mentioned, especially in the last few years, I've helped people write their memoirs, and so I know a little bit about what you were doing, and I know the immense task. But for me, I could call them and walk through things to help them write their memoir. You had a relationship with Eugene Peterson, author of the Message Bible. And could you share a little bit about that relationship and then the process of this book, just who the man was and the impact he's had on you, and boy, the
Yeah.
impact he's had on all of us.
So yeah, he's probably most widely known as the translator of the Message, but I think a lot of people, his biggest impact is his voice to pastors, um, sort of offering a clarion call to remind us of the ancient vocation of being a pastor, and how a lot of the way we're approaching this in the modern world is abandoning the old ways,
Right.
the hopeful, good, and true and beautiful ways. But then also, I think in our particular moment of history, particularly in the United States, um, Eugene was a voice of sanity, of gentleness, of conviction, of profound and deep theology that was um, immersed in the soul and the heart. It was the very best that I think of like Christian tradition and witness.
Yeah.
And I think in an age where more and more Christian leaders are showing themselves to be unfaithful, to be ego driven, to be building personal kingdoms and power structures,
Right.
it was um, a deep place of light
Yeah.
to encounter someone who was gentle and faithful and humble, and yet wise, and the most widely read person I'd ever met. I first was given one of his books um, by an elder in a church I was pastoring, and it immediately began to uh, pierce me. I don't. I just hadn't had anyone plainly say in such beautiful and plain, weighty words like what it meant to be a pastor.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Wow.
it just opened up a world to me. I began to write letters with him. He became a pastor to me from a distance. And 2016, I became his biographer, and he just generously opened up their life, their home, handed me all of their journals and letters and manuscripts, and I lugged them back through multiple trips from Montana to Virginia, and spent the next 3.5 years writing his biography. And it was just the deepest joy. I wanted to write it, partly just because as a writer it was just an amazing task,
Yeah.
but but really the deeper thing was I cared so much about who Eugene was, and I feel like his voice is so potent for this moment that um, the beauty of Eugene is not so much what he said, but who he was as a person and what it was to encounter him. And I do think you could encounter him in some ways through his writing, and you could encounter him through his speaking, but just to encounter his person,
Yeah.
sitting with he and Jan in the living room and having a conversation with him and watching him look out the window at those Mission Range mountains across the lake that he would look at every day of his life,
Right.
and just how he would be caught up in that wonder and holiness. Um,
Right.
I wanted people to encounter Eugene, and so that's what I set out to do.
Yeah. Because you mentioned it, and I know that that's what you are doing right now. Um, how would you describe, especially today, when I think so many folks and a whole lot of those that are listening um, uh, have wounds that are actually been inflicted by the guy that wore the title pastor,
Hmm.
um, because of all the reasons you've talked about. And I think we have a whole lot of men and women out there pastoring that weren't ever pastored, actually. So,
Yeah.
how would you describe a pastor? What would be your description? What was the thing that made your heart
Um,
burn when you first read Eugene's words?
from Eugene's words, I would say it's human learning to live in and give away the immense love of God. Um, so I think every word of that probably matters. I mean, the human, like I think a lot of pastors are not taught how to be true humans. They're to be entrepreneurs or
Right.
leadership coaches or you know uh, fundraisers or building platforms or whatever, and they're not really taught that being with God is to become more human, not less.
Wow.
um,
Yeah. So good.
and then it's living in, not that God is not a project. The church is not a project.
Right.
It's not a, hey, do I want to build a business or do I want to build a religious organization called a church?
Yep.
That the church is the living, breathing uh, a presence of Christ in the world, and we don't get to control
Yeah.
that. So it's living in the love of God and then giving the love of God away. Um, an old Anglican priest, Archbishop actually, Michael Ramsey, he puts it one of my favorite ways. He says to be a priest, so you could say to be a pastor, is to be with God, with the people on your heart. Um, I think that about says it for me. Um,
Wow.
and so um, it's a vocation that there's a lot of faithful pastors out there, but there's also a lot of really unfaithful pastors
Yeah.
who um, are operating out of their wounds more than they are out of the love of God.
Yeah. Yeah. You did. I mean, you just described Jesus. Um, when you say to be a priest or to be a pastor is to be with God, with the people on your heart. I mean, um, he's a beautiful picture of that. It's a very relational approach, and with such a high value for people. I think one of the key things that you keep, and I think my first statement that we belong to one another. Uh, I felt that as a through line for everything, but but it places such a high value on humanity, and I think maybe one of the places where we are wrestling something back is that right there. I mean, actually the book John Blaze helped me write or helped edit is titled Prone to Love, and the idea was that another grandma story in her 70s in a worship, always at church, grandma, it's probably a Wednesday night, and Come Thou Fount, beautiful song, a beautiful song if you understand and know the story behind it too. Is they're singing this song, and my cousin's there, Jonathan's there with her, and he notices that grandma gets stubborn and stops singing, and for a minute thinks something is wrong. And the part of the song "Prone to Wander, Lord, I Feel It" had just passed, and when he got concerned and he leaned over and he said, "Grandma, what's wrong?" And she said, "I'm not prone to wander, Jonathan. I love him." And I was writing this book, and that ended up becoming the title. And it was not to suggest that we don't have the ability to miss the mark. That would be silly. Of course we do. Everyone has a front row seat to their own ability to miss the mark. What it was that I had been raised with this lens. Talk about rethinking this lens, where humanity had a proclivity, if left alone, left to their own, they would always choose wrong. That we were prone to wander, and then prone to wander. I feel it. Became our doctrine, and we camped out around our ability to miss it. And what that did was it gave a sense, and I think you mentioned it, a sense of walking through life with this disconnect, like I'm not worth the blood of Jesus, or I'm not quite valuable, or I'm not quite. And I love your high value for humanity, because I don't think you can pastor well if that isn't there. That's my question: is to the extent you're convinced that God is, that all are in Christ, and God, that there was this plan for humanity, that he has this value for humanity, as I don't know how you could pastor otherwise in the way that you're talking about.
Yeah, although a lot of us do.
As I mentioned before we got started, a lot of folks listening to this right now would probably use the language of deconstruction. There's so many ways in which that can be understood. Sometimes people are reacting to things, and reactions, often aren't as helpful as responses. But I think there is a movement taking place right now because of some of the things you just talked about. We had Scott McKnight on. I don't know if you know who that is, but as Scott mentioned, he mentioned John Maxwell, and was thankful for his strategies and structures, but said something I had never thought of before, that most of us embraced John Maxwell as though he was teaching us how to pastor, but he was giving us business plans. He was giving us how to run a business. And I think many of us have grown up in the grind of business is all about performance. It's all mathematical equations. It's all numbers driven. And I think most of us have grown up or felt that, certainly by people who wear the title pastor. And so I think there's a whole lot of folks right now trying to find the person you're talking about,
Yeah.
or become the person you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, the good news, there's only one. His name is Jesus.
Yeah,
So the deeper question is, how do we continually live in the story of Jesus? And,
I love that.
you know, um, it's certainly true that many of us carry deep and profound wounds. I've had to work through my own, and went through a
Yeah,
really long and dark season that didn't last for months. It lasted for years and raised huge questions for me.
right.
Um,
Yeah,
and I just think um, this is a time to go deeper into God. I mean, we have the resources. The Psalms are a profound um, document for deconstruction, if one wants to label it that way.
sure. Yeah, that's good. Yeah,
What's distinct about it is that it's directed to God. It's done as an act of prayer. It's one thing to be um, uh, brutal with our wounds, our anger, our rage, our questions, our disillusionment, and take that to God.
Yeah.
It's a different thing to um, use those things as another excuse to run away from God.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so I think we need to have immense patience with ourselves, with one another, gentleness, kindness. We're not in a rush. God's not in a hurry. Um, the the line of love is very very long. Um, this is a very long story.
Yes.
One thing I would want to say is, amid all of that, um, it's still true that humans have a unique penchant for finding reasons, crazy as they are, when you can look at them with clear eyes, for running away from love.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
um, I, I would hate for honest questions that need to arise to somehow again be twisted as yet another reason that we come up with for running away from the one who actually does love us.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. Yeah. The cornerstone, we've said it on this podcast often that I think deconstruction is actually quite biblical. That you can, it's woven all throughout. It's rethinking, but the cornerstone is always Jesus. The whole point is to read, if you've lost the plot, to rediscover the cornerstone, to because the whole point of deconstruction is not the demolition, it's what are we building. And I love that you said it's a long narrative. We have a saying in our house, family is the long game. And uh and I think we're in the long game with our heavenly Father. So
Yeah,
and he's really good at what he does. So
yeah. And I think one of the ways we can get a clue that maybe this is turning into something that's not honest and true is when we're becoming cynical.
yeah,
Um, because when we are
it's good.
asking difficult questions, when we are rethinking what we've been taught, where we're coming from, when we're investigating our stories, the whole point is to lead us deeper into love.
Yes. Yes.
Um, Cynicism is the opposite of love.
Yeah.
Cynicism is controlled by suspicion and guardedness, self-protection.
Yeah.
Usually accompanies, oddly enough, perhaps a reverse kind of fundamentalism where you are absolute in your
Yep.
opinions
Yep.
and you are reactionary to others and enraged.
Yep.
Um, so I would just say, just being curious and like, yeah, let's let's tend to our questions really well,
Yeah.
and let's
Yeah.
have friends who can walk this journey with us and
Yeah.
give ourselves space and energy. And when we start noticing cynicism becoming a strong thread in our story, that's probably a little warning sign.
I love that. That is a warning sign. It's brilliant, man, because um, I've had those moments in my life. Disappointment uh, can become uh, it's something you want to acknowledge, but you can't camp there.
Hmm.
You can't make a life there. There's no future hope where you're cynical, where that becomes the lens through which all things are perceived. And for me, again, the number one thing that I'm always running at is, what I find myself writing and going after is anything on our lens regarding the goodness of God, anything that would undermine love. Again, greater love. There's no greater love than this cruciform love, this other-centered, self-giving love. That is the place where you can place your trust, and where you deal with cynicism, and where you can deal with disappointment, and you can ask questions. That's a safe place then to ask questions or to investigate. A lot of folks on this that listen are investigating what community looks like right now, outside of the institutional model they grew up with. And that, I would like that before we close. That was a question I had banging around over here. It just came back around that, as you're pouring into pastors and you've just described what a pastor is, I think personally, and knowing that there's lots of folks listening to this podcast on a Sunday morning as they gather with three folks or three families and do church, what do you see right now for the church, not just in, I mean, we could just stay in North America, but what do you see happening for the church? I see a lot of pastors that aren't pastoring in the traditional sense, or at least in the institutional models right now. And I'm curious what you think about that, and if you have thoughts about where you see the church going in these coming years.
Yeah, that's probably a bigger question than we could tackle in 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just looked at the
Um,
clock. Yeah.
I'm of a couple different minds. One thing I would say, I love the line from Flannery O'Connor is, God brings, God seems to bring people into the kingdom in ways that the church doesn't allow.
That's good.
I think grace is immense. The presence of Christ invades the world everywhere, the whole earth. I mean, Psalms talks about, the earth is filled with the glory of God. That literally the ground on which we stand,
Yeah.
we wouldn't be able to stand on solid ground if it was not filled with the love and mercy of God. So, you
Yeah.
know, to
Yeah.
to Christians and agnostics and atheists, I want to say to all of us, you actually can't escape the love of God. I mean, you can try, you can resist, you can run, but literally
Right.
with every
That's
breath,
good.
you are filled with the life of God, and with every step you take, you are undergirded by the
Yeah.
life of God. So, good luck,
Yeah.
And
That's good.
I'm grateful for. I think people have to be where they are. I mean, people have to receive grace where it's available. Have to find friendships in ways that work. Um, I I have a lot of open handedness.
Yeah.
And having said that, um, I believe in the church. And I don't think the church is something at the end of the day that we get to just define in any way we want to. Um,
Right.
I think there is something. I mean, I know it's so popular. I don't even use language of institutional church.
Okay.
I don't know what that means anymore.
Right.
Um,
That's a good point.
and there's another part of me. If by institution we mean organized and something that I'm responsible to and that holds responsibility over me, I don't know what other kind of church there could be.
Right. Right. Yeah. It has to be organized.
Yeah,
The more where two are gathered, there's got to
yeah,
be some sort of organization. Yeah.
yeah. So um, I mean, I think a lot of it's a work in in process. But at the end of the day, kind of like Eugene, I guess, he said he was once asked about how do we help people grow up into life with God, and the question at the time was probably around like discipleship and how do we functionally disciple people, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, I think there are lots of ways at any given time and moment that might arise by the Spirit for us to help people grow in the relationship with God. But in the long story, nothing that circumnavigates baptism and Eucharist. And I believe that.
That's good.
I I understand the desire at times and even need at times to walk away from a church I've been a part of for 2 decades because the wounds are too deep and I don't have the answers and I don't know where a safe place is to go. But if that morphs into a sense that I can create this on my own, disconnected from the body of Christ and the people of God across time and history, and the story that has been nurtured and that martyrs have died for,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
That's
that
good.
I can create a community that essentially is like a cocoon
Yeah.
that is ultimately years later basically to my liking. um, I think we've created uh, just another mess.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
um, I think Eugene, when people asked him, how do I find a church, he gave advice that few of us are going to like and almost no one's going to actually do. But his advice was, find the church closest to you and go there.
Right.
um, because it's not about um, finding the place that fits or a place that answers all your questions. It's
Yeah.
about submitting yourself to relationship with others before the person of Christ. And then he would usually add, and if 6 months later you just can't take it, then find the next closest church. Um, And he himself didn't even keep that advice. He went to a Lutheran church, so he had to pass another church to get there. But there is something
I
about,
get the concept.
yeah.
I get what he's saying. He's challenging it.
And I frankly, like, that's kind of where I am. I'm in a moment myself where I believe in the reality of the church. And by that, I don't just mean a spiritualized, ethereal. I mean the physical, um, messy thing called the church. Like, I believe in it
Yep.
more deeply than
Yep.
I ever have.
Love
And
it.
simultaneously, I have lower expectations for what any one church is actually going to live up to.
Right.
Um,
Right.
I, I, in this moment, I think the only thing that's more disturbing than, um, Christians doing bad things in God's name is the fact that we're surprised that Christians
Right.
do bad
Right.
things
Right.
in God's name, because Christians are not ones who don't need rescue and salvation. We're ought to be the front of the line saying, "Please rescue
Right.
me. I need salvation." So it's a mess. I think we are all figuring this out, but I think 25 years from now, um, we're going to need the old story more than we ever have.
Right. I love that. I love that, man. I appreciate that. I think you could go on for this on this topic for an hour. I have a feeling that I can catch your passion and your. I ask people, what's the one thing you got to tell us? What's burning in you right now? I have a feeling this would be front and center. One of the things you'd want to talk about. I agree. I think
Mm-hmm.
tradition. I think we have to have. Well, I think family is the long game. So I think that we've got to be able to look back and we got to be able to see forward. I could ask you, I don't, as we don't have much time, the things that I know I'm navigating are more, what does it look like? What does it look like? Not that it doesn't look like an organization. It doesn't, that has to happen. And the first thing that happens when you gather a bunch of people is you need someone to watch the kids. I mean, it's just what happens. Um, it's more a matter of I am curious if we are going to see shifting in models and things that would be more um, help develop people in the context of relationship with a pastor in the way that you just described a pastor. Some of the way that I think the thing has been set up over the last 20 years has not been helpful to that kind of holistic relational connection between an actual person who's pastoring in the way that you've described. Those are some of the things I imagine but
Yeah, well,
anyway.
I mean, most of what we're seeing now is so new and it's so American. Um, I mean, even something really simple. You don't have to go back very far, where most of the church was organized as a parish model.
Right.
Um,
Right.
I mean, you have a little geographical area,
Yep.
and that's your people.
Yep.
And even the people who don't show up at your church on Sunday, they're still your people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the pastor would walk the neighborhood, and
Yep.
the pastor would be in the coffee shop or be in the baker's shop. And
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
like, to me, I mean, once a pastor becomes a figurehead who's more about raising money and, you know, creating PowerPoint presentations,
Yeah.
I
Business
mean,
model.
we've lost the thread. So
Yeah. That's that. We had Daniel Grothy on. He talked about the power of place and
yeah,
what what we've kind of lost there. I think that's true, and I'm looking forward to how God's going to raise up those who will restore that to us.
Mhm.
And I believe it. I do believe it. And I like you. I have my own. I often say that's I grew up in the church. I have the scars to prove it.
yeah,
But he hit the church was his idea, and he only has good ones. So.
yeah.
Amen. Hey, I've had you for just over an hour. We're called Rethinking God with Tacos. A quick question before I let you go. You a taco guy?
Love tacos. Yes.
That's right. That's the only right answer.
Mhm.
Do you have any particular spot there or place that you got to go? What's your taco? What's the best taco?
Well, I will say I'm a Texan who finds myself in
Uh
Michigan. So,
huh. Okay.
but there is a sizable Hispanic community here, so there are good tacos to be found. But if I'm really honest, my personal preference is a good Tex-Mex fajita taco. So I want the serious meat, no sauce, lots of rub. I want the the peppers and onions grilled. I want some good fresh jalapenos in there, and I want a flour tortilla that's been grilled on the flat iron so that it's got that crispiness to it. So
absolutely, that is the perfect. That's me too. I can talk about any taco, but I would do a Tex-Mex taco almost every time. So that's awesome. Hey, it's been awesome connecting with you. Can you just share where folks can find you?
Sure. They can find the Peterson Center where I'm working, and we have some upcoming things they might be interested in, or our email list, but it's petersoncenter.org, or they can find my personal writing site at Winn, Winn Collier.com.
Awesome, man. I appreciate you taking the time to spend with me and talk with me about the goodness of God, bro. It's been really, really good connecting with you. Appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
Hey guys, so glad you joined us. You can find me, Jason Clark, online at afamilystory.org. I encourage you to sign up on our mailing list. We send out an email twice a month letting you know about new podcasts, articles, and new books or products that we have coming out. Plus, occasionally I'll keep you up on my schedule where I'm traveling. My Twitter handle is @JasonClarkIs. I'm on Instagram under the same handle, and you can find me on Facebook as well. Hey, all of these podcasts are available on all the platforms, iTunes, Spotify, Google. If you could, like and share across all your media platforms and write a review on iTunes. It really does help expand the message and build the audience. Hey, love doing this journey with you. Praying grace and wonder over you today.